I'm not going to make predictions, and I also have to say, I mean, for many years I was, because it was my job as well as my passion, I was steeped in the kind of intricacies of the sort of global conversation and the United Nations negotiations about climate change. I'm one of the veterans of Copenhagen. I bear the scars of it, I mean, I think it's. Let me say a few things about it without getting into the minutiae. I mean, climate change. First of all, climate change is the only problem we have ever had to face that really will affect everybody in the world. Climate change itself and the responses to it will affect everybody in the world. So everybody has a legitimate voice. And by the way, and I'll perhaps come back to this later, the people whose voices ought to be heard with most attention on climate change are those of young people. Because young people, my son's generation, people in their 20s, at the moment, it's my generation, people in our 50s, who by and large have our hands on the levers of power, but it's their generation that will have to live with the consequences of how we pull those levers and the mistakes. So everybody has a legitimate voice on climate change, and there is only one place where that, and for all of its imperfections and its frustrations, where we can have any kind of institutional global conversation that is linked to the decisions that governments take on behalf of taxpayers in order to pursue the public good. That's the United Nations. So first point, it's really important that that process continues, that that conversation continues, that people continue to have trust in it, that it doesn't turn into a kind of zombie conversation. If you want an example of a zombie conversation internationally, look at the trade negotiations, which have been, it really is the sort of living dead over there in the trade negotiations, achieving nothing ever since Seattle and before. We can't afford that and it's not that they don't happen, the meetings still happen, but nobody has any belief in them. We can't afford that to happen in the UN negotiations. But then you say, what does it take for those negotiations to succeed? And then you have to think about what is an international negotiation. A lot of people talk about this with enormous confidence without having any idea of what they really mean, because they don't have the direct experience, or even if they do, they haven't thought about the dynamics of it enough. In a negotiation between governments, an intergovernmental negotiation, officials and ministers come from their capitals, get on airplanes, come from and they have what you call a mandate, which is essentially a negotiating, or it's a portfolio of negotiating positions which has bottom lines in it. What's the highest level of ambition that we can make commitments at? And you're trying to kind of solve a Rubik's Cube where you get an outcome which is compatible with everybody's level of ambition. So there are two questions. One is, how with great negotiating skill can you squeeze as much ambition out of the mandates in their existing form? That's the negotiating problem. But the second question, which for me is the key question, is if that maximum level of ambition which can be encompassed in terms of the mandates that people have, if that's not enough, what do you do? How do you expand the limits of the possible? That's not a negotiating question. And the serious problem we have on climate change is that we haven't, at the moment, those mandates, if you take them together, where we'll have how fast is China willing to go, how fast is America willing to go, how fast is Europe willing to go, and so on. If you take that, they are not capable of encompassing disruptive change, transformation, at the speed with which we need to achieve it. They're essentially business as usual with knobs on, with minor adjustments. So if you want that negotiation to succeed, it's not a question of sending more negotiators or better negotiators. It's a question of building political will inside the polities, the societies, the economies that are sending the negotiators there. That's got very little to do with the negotiations themselves, and it's all to do with arms and legs politics and building a consensus inside society that our national interest lies, our security, our prosperity, our sense of justice, all of that lies in moving at this pace rather than in resisting that pace. We haven't done that. And that's why Copenhagen, you asked where was it successful, where was it unsuccessful, and not everybody would agree with it. It was a massive strategic failure. It set the cause back by a long time. As I say, I bear the scars. After Copenhagen, I made it my business to go round very quietly. I was at that time in that climate ambassador role. I went round having private conversations for 6 months afterwards, with as many board members of key international companies that I could find, to find out what they really, not what their PR people were saying in public. Of course, in public they were saying, we've got to build on this and try harder, and we're all in favour. Nobody wants to be seen as being against an effective response to climate change. I wanted to find out what they privately thought. And what they privately thought was this, and it's still what they think by and large, which is, governments are talking the talk, but they're not prepared. They haven't got the will to walk the walk. They haven't got the will to put in place policies at the level of ambition that will be necessary to divert our private capital allocation decisions away from high carbon outcomes and onto low carbon outcomes. We're investing into policy-driven markets. We can't make decisions that will cause our shareholders to sack us. So we have to make rational choices as companies. And so what we need to know is, we can invest in the low carbon economy, but only if the policy framework makes it worth our while. And what we need to know then is, do governments, and governments of course are rooted in politics, so does politics view this venture, this endeavour, as on or off? And we looked at it after Copenhagen, we looked them in the eye, and what we saw in their eyes, not what we heard them say, but what we saw, this is off. This is off. This is too difficult. You're asking me as the leader of America or China or Germany or Britain or wherever to come back and tell my people, you know what, this is not an opportunity. I didn't embrace an opportunity. I took a risk with your jobs, your growth, your competitiveness, your pensions. I took a risk with that. Don't ask me to take that. So I didn't take it. And I reined in my ambition, and I didn't sign up to what would have needed to be signed up to make Copenhagen a success. And it was therefore a failure, and it was off. And meanwhile, we in our boards of our multinational companies are going to carry on investing in essentially a business as, with a bit of window dressing and taking the opportunities where they exist, but not on a transformational scale and at a transformational pace. And that's where we are at the moment. And if we've got a summit, we've got the first this month in New York, 23rd of September, the first climate change summit since Copenhagen, since 2009. So nearly 5 years on. The first time world leaders will have had to think about climate change and have a conversation about climate. It is not encouraging, I have to say, that a number of world leaders are already saying that they're not going to bother to go. Chancellor Merkel in Germany has said that she's not going to go. And you can identify others. I think Prime Minister Modi in India has said that he's not going to. That is not encouraging, actually, because if this is a head of government, for governments, it's a head of government conversation, or it's nothing at all. But anyway, we have coming up next year, at the end of next year, one of the annual meetings in this series of UN conferences in Paris, the so-called Conference of Parties. That was what Copenhagen was, and that's our next shot at this. And if we don't come out of that, not much more than a year ahead, in such a way as to convince all of those people who looked at it and said, no, I don't believe it's on, I think it's off, we need to convince them that it's on again, and that it's going to be backed up by policy frameworks of much greater ambition. It's about politics, Stuart. And actually, the more I've become involved in this debate, the more this is not about fixing climate policy. And it's not even about fixing climate politics. It's about fixing politics itself. If you can't fix politics, you can't fix climate politics. And if your politics is so dysfunctional that it allows the status quo to resist these kind of transformational changes that are in the public interest without there even being a serious political conversation about it, then it's politics itself that needs to be fixed. And I'll give you a really good measure of that, if I may. I've become, slightly reluctantly, I've become drawn in a bit to the debate in, at least in England. I haven't had any exposure to the debate in Scotland. I'd like to, actually, about fracking for shale gas, which is quite interesting because there are quite a lot of communities now up and down England anyway who see themselves as being in the crosshairs of the fracking companies, and so they then sort of start to ask themselves, what are we letting ourselves in for here? And what you then find is very quickly they, as a community, start to reach the conclusion that they don't like the look of it. And if you visit those places, it's actually quite inspiring because you see communities of people who are not used to talking to each other politically, coming together from all kinds of different backgrounds and political traditions and cultural backgrounds, coming together to say together, how can we stop this happening? And if you talk to them about how they feel about it and how they feel about politics more generally, you get the same message up and down the country, which is politics is now an ugly word. It's when you use the word politics, it makes us immediately, there's a kind of aversion reflex. Why? Because it feels like something that is done to us, not something that is done with us. Politics is what they do to people from outside, interests from outside, from a long way away, whether it's Westminster or the City of London or even Wall Street coming in with their money, imposing a prefabricated outcome on us, which may be in their interest, but is not in our interest, and we don't like that. And fracking, the debate about fracking has actually come to symbolise that deeper unease about politics. And on the whole, that's what politics has degenerated into. And there are lots and lots of kinds of people who feel disenfranchised, who have turned their backs. They've rationalised it by saying to themselves, you know, there are lots of things happening that are complicated and that I don't really, I don't understand subprime mortgages and systemic risk in the financial system. But surely those clever people in suits in the City of London, they understand it. And there are grown-ups somewhere whose job it is to sort it out, and they'll sort it out. My message to them, I can I've been inside the institutions of the establishment for more of my career than I've been outside. My message to them is there are no grown-ups. Do not labour for half a moment under the misconception that there are some grown-ups somewhere who are going to sort out these complex problems of interdependence, who know enough about how these systems, these institutional frameworks, the economic frameworks, how they work so that they can fix them. If we want them sorted out, we've got to take ownership of that problem, and we collectively have to have a conversation where we are really clear about the kind of society and the kind of economy we want to live in. We want to live in a society where power is evenly distributed, not unevenly distributed, where it feels as if this is where we have, where it feels like power with, if you like. You can have power with or you can have power over. We want to live, because this is part of being a resilient society, in an economy where, not everybody is exactly equal, but there is an end to the absolutely obscene degrees, orders of magnitude of inequality, which have built up, because at the moment we're in a situation where those who have more than a certain amount of wealth are able to acquire even more, whereas those who are excluded from those opportunities can't acquire any and feel increasingly at risk of ending up on the scrap heap, as it were. That's destabilizing in any society, and with that degree of destabilization, you can't build the cohesion. These are all problems. Climate change is an example of a problem that you can only deal with if you have a certain amount of cohesion across society. So we need to make politics work again, and above all, we need to bring the voice of young people who've rather turned their backs, and perhaps in the hope that the grown-ups will sort it out. I don't know, but we need their voice, their inspiration, their ability to summon hope and positive, constructive responses to problems rather than cynical, fatalistic ones. We need to bring their voice back into politics. When you talk to young people who've thought a bit and discussed a bit about climate change, it's not, do you believe the science, or is it too late to do anything about it, or can we really build a renewables-based energy system? It's tell us, don't tell us whether we're going to do it. Tell us we're going to do it and what we need to do to play our part in it, including how much pain we need to bear, because we'd rather bear the pain of playing our part in it than bear the much bigger pain of it not happening at all.